in today's cosplay video, we're going to be making the corset for Vex from the Legend of Vox Machina. To make Vex's corset, I'm using the pattern from Indigo patterns on Etsy. This is a digital pattern, so you start by printing out the first page, making sure the box is to scale, then printing out all of the pages. Unlike some of the other patterns from this creator, it does not have seam allowance, so I'm going to be adding the seam allowance to the sides, but I won't be adding the seam allowance to the bottom or the top because this is going to be finished with bias tape later. For the outer part of the corset, I first cut the pieces out of some purple printed cotton and then use that as a template to cut out the pieces from some stretch suede, and then I serged the edges to keep the two pieces together and treat them as one piece. And my reason for doing that is simply because the stretch suede is stretchy and thin and really difficult to work with, so hopefully this will make it a bit more manageable. I also laid all of the corset pieces out so that I can keep myself organized since the pieces do look a lot alike. Here is what it looks like with all of the corset outer pieces sewn together. I cut all of the corset lining pieces out of black cotton and sewed them together. I pressed the seams of the lining open. Then I took some twill tape and just hand basted it with some loose stitches that will come out later along the waistline of the corset to act as the waist tape. I went through and sewed down all of the seam allowances, leaving the tops and bottoms open, and this is so that we can use them as boning channels. The stitching also secured the tape in place, so now we can remove all of the basting stitches. Putting right sides together, sew the corset outer to the corset lining along the side seams on both sides. Turn the corset right side out and sew a line of stitching on either side, and this is going to serve as a boning channel. Then we're going to sew the two pieces together along the top. Then I sewed two more lines of stitching, leaving the bottom open to create one more boning channel. And this is so that we can put the eyelets in between two pieces of boning and make it a bit more secure. Then I cut plastic boning to the appropriate length and inserted it into each of the boning channels. Once we have the boning in, we can sew the bottom edge of the corset closed. To finish off the raw edges of the corset, we're going to bind them in bias tape. Admittedly, mine isn't cut on the true bias because the material is stretchy, but if you're using a non-stretch fabric, you definitely want it to be cut on the bias. And to lace up the corset, I have some rather not very pretty hand-bound eyelets, but you could use some hammer-in ones as well. Just again, because the material is stretchy, I prefer to have hand-sewn to have them be a bit more secure. To lace up the back, I simply used some black double-faced satin ribbon. To make Vex's belts, I cut 3 strips of some dark brown pleather. Then I trimmed away some of the material on one of the sides to create a rounded edge. Fold the edges over and we're going to hem the edges of the belt pieces. Personally, I find it easier to use a loose stitch and sew around where I want my fold lines to be, especially on a thicker pleather like this. Loop the straight end of the belt through the buckle and sew it into place. You could put eyelets into the belt, but I decided to just punch holes where the buckle's going to go. On one of the belts, I sewed on a jump ring. This will serve as the attachment point for the bottom half of the quiver. To keep the belts in place, I made some quick belt loops just using some embroidery floss. I'm not worried about these supporting a bunch of weight or anything. They're just to keep the belts in position. And here is what it looks like with the belts on. The corset is a little lumpy. I'm hoping that's because my dress form isn't quite the same proportions as I am, and it'll look a little bit smoother when it's being worn. Now all that's left is to make her accessories, and that video will be out tomorrow, so please subscribe and stay tuned.